Welcome to our program. This is the first in a new series of programs recently taped in Israel that we've chosen to title Treasures of the Jewish World. It's unfortunate, but most Christians today have little or no knowledge of the historical and cultural foundations of their faith. Much of what we experience and much of what we do is a product of the Hellenistic world, dating from the 4th and 5th centuries of the present era. There is little understanding that the historical foundations of the Christian faith are rooted firmly in the Judaism of the 1st century, in the land of Israel, and in cities such as Nazareth, Capernaum, and other cities around the Sea of Galilee, and, of course, the city of Jerusalem. Although most Christians are at least passively aware that Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew, yet there are those who believe that he was the first Christian and the founder of the Christian church. However, Jesus was not only a Jew, but a rabbi, and utilized well-known rabbinic methods in his teaching and operated entirely within the structure of the historic Judaism of his day. Further, this new movement that grew out of the teachings of Jesus and his disciples was a movement that operated strictly within the confines of the Judaism of Jesus' day. When we think of treasure, we usually think of some tangible object of intrinsic worth. But in our new series, Treasures of the Jewish World, I would like to invite you to come and go back with me in time and look at treasures of immeasurable worth, ideas, concepts, and people that altogether serve as the historical backdrop for our faith. I can think of no better place to begin than the city of Jerusalem, and one of the most sacred and historically significant sites in all the Jewish world, the Temple Mount, the Temple of God in Jerusalem. In Jesus' day, it had been refurbished by Herod the Great and surpassed in architectural splendor and majesty any structure throughout all of ancient Israel. In the Talmud, in Tractate Sukkah 51 and 2, it states, "No one has seen a truly beautiful building unless he has seen the temple." Herod's project of refurbishing the temple to win the favor of the Jews was a monumental enterprise that required vast quantities of building materials, including huge, hand-chiseled, smooth, rectangular stones, each containing a border called a marginal draft, so distinctive in style, size, and workmanship that the stones are called Herodian stones. According to Josephus, 10,000 stonemasons and stone cutters labored, and over 1,000 wagons were manufactured to help bring the stones from the quarry. The re-innovation of the temple probably began in the 18th year of King Herod, around 20 BC, and although the temple proper was probably completed in his lifetime, the plan as a whole was probably never completely finished. The Gospel of John in chapter 2 and verse 20 tells us that it took 46 years to build this magnificent temple of God. The archaeological excavations at the Temple Mount were unique in many ways. First, it was one of the few archaeological excavations to work year-round. And secondly, it was one of the few to enjoy such a large number of volunteers that came from all over the world to give both their time and effort in the accomplishment of a monumental archaeological task. And finally, the discoveries themselves are some of the most exciting and historically significant of any archaeological excavations in Israel to date. The archaeological excavations at the Temple Mount began in February of 1968, just shortly after the Jews were provided access to the area after the Six-Day War that took place in June of 1967, and I personally joined the excavations in June of 1968, and we immediately excavated down and found the base of the archway at the staircase that led into the Tyropean Valley. Let me show it to you here on this reconstruction of the temple compound that was drawn as a result of our archaeological excavations. And here you see the area where we began and the staircase that led into the Tyropean Valley, providing access into the temple itself. We found the limestone street that ran along the southern wall of the temple compound, and at the southwest corner of the street and of the temple itself, we found here on the street evidences of the destruction of the temple that took place on the 9th day of the Jewish month of Av in 70 of the present era. And one of the stones had an inscription on it in Hebrew that said, "To the place of trumpeting, Levet Hatki'ah." The stone that marked the very place here way up on top of the temple itself, where the priest would stand to blow the shofar to announce the beginning of the Sabbath and other feasts and festivals. We know of this from the writings of Josephus in Wars of the Jews, Book 4, Chapter 9, and paragraph 12. And I'd like to read to you just a little brief sentence. It says, "And the last was erected above the top of the Postaphoria, where one of the priests stood, of course, and gave a signal beforehand with a trumpet at the beginning of every 7th day, in the evening twilight, as also at the evening when the day was finished, as giving notice to the people when they were to leave off work and when they were to go to work again." And this is the only record of which we know describing the blowing of the shofar to mark the beginning and the end of the Sabbath. As our excavations progressed, we moved out into this area known as the Ophel, and we found this monumental staircase leading up to double gates in the southern wall that provided access into the temple itself. And here, in this monumental staircase, we found a ritual immersion bath complex. And perhaps this whole area is to be associated with the events recorded in the 2nd chapter of the book of Acts relative to the preaching of the gospel by the Apostle Peter and the falling of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost. This whole area is well known to us in Jewish sources as the assembling area for the Jews during the 3 great pilgrim festivals, Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now this whole area, fortunately for us, has been opened up today as an archaeological garden. Now when we go to our field report, you're going to see the support wall behind me dating from the Herodian, Crusader, and Turkish periods, 3 different historical periods. And that will be located here on our map. Now you notice the lower courses of stones are the Herodian stones with their marginal draft. And the height of most of these stones, these smooth-cut ashlars, as they're called, is about 3.3 feet. They're remarkable for their length, and some of them measure over 36 feet long and weigh from 50 to 100 tons or more. Needless to say, the temple of God was not only a great treasure of the Jewish world, but an engineering marvel. This wall, where we're going to be going, is not a part of the temple itself, but it is one of the most sacred sites in Judaism. Only since June of 1967 has it been readily accessible to not just Jews, but all who would visit this sacred site. In the background, you'll see Jews from the various periods of Judaism, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, as well as perhaps people from other faiths. But principally, notice the Orthodox, those in black who come daily to stand or sit before the wall and to recite their prayers. Behind me is perhaps what is considered to be one of the greatest treasures of the Jewish world. With me today is Rabbi Dr. Daniel Trapper, the former advisor to the Minister of Education here in Israel. Rabbi, it's good to have you with me on the program today, and can you tell us what is this wall that's behind us here?
Well, I'm delighted to be here, Roy. This wall is one of the holiest sites in the Jewish world. It has two names. It's called either the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. The Wailing Wall because it's a place where so many Jews have come to wail, to cry, to shed tears, and kind of talk directly to God. A kind of feeling that it's just about the closest place physically I can get to God. And it's called the Western Wall because this is the support wall, the western support wall of what was the outer court of the Holy Temple when it stood in Jerusalem before it was destroyed about 1900 years ago by Titus. The wall that we see here actually is only a small portion of the Western Wall itself. You got about 50% of it above ground. Originally, the area that we're standing on was much deeper. This was a much taller wall, and the whole exposed area here is maybe 10% of its real length. It goes down about another 500 meters, which the archaeologists have been digging now. The wall is special also in its construction. I mean, the stones you see out here are relatively small compared to some of the others. There are some stones in there that are about 16 meters long and over 50 tons in weight. It's just a massive structure. Now, we believe that this wall remained more than any of the other walls of the temple because we're told that the other walls were built by the rich people. It was the poor people that built this wall. And God said, because they built this wall is going to last forever. And so now for 1900 years we haven't had a temple, and we've only had this wall, which is the only remnant of that great temple, and it's a symbolic remembrance of the glory which we once had on this place. And so the Jews, for 1900 years, have come to this spot, just about uninterrupted, and prayed to God for all their needs.
Now, this wall actually wasn't a part of the original temple, was it?
No, this wall was a wall of the outer court which surrounded the temple itself. We have no remnants of the temple building itself. That's further in. The Dome of the Rock, which is that beautiful structure with the gold top, that's the spot where the temple was once constructed, but there's nothing remaining.
What would you say is the importance of the wall for the Jewish people today?
Well, the wall is important because it's what we have, what remains. I would assume that for someone living 2,000 years ago when the temple was up, the wall was rather secondary. I mean, this was only the wall of the outer courtyard. For that person, the main thing that he had was the temple itself. But for us, this is all we have, and therefore it's of such great significance, especially because of the special love that God has for it since it was built by the poor people.
Now tell me, who are these people that are over here behind us, especially those in the black and with the prayer shawls? Who are these people?
Well, these people themselves are Orthodox Jews, Jews that are generally associated with the Hasidic group. This is a sect within Orthodoxy. They're wearing prayer shawls, many of them. You see wearing these white, it's called talitot in Hebrew. They're prayer shawls that one uses when he prays.
Now, the ones that are religious that come here to pray, basically what is it for which they're praying?
Well, they pray for many things. Jewish prayer is generally silent prayer, and therefore we never know exactly what someone is saying. But there are really two kinds of prayers. The first is a personal prayer. Each one of us has our own needs: health, family, economic problems, business problems. Everyone prays for what he himself needs. And then there is communal prayer, the kind of prayer that we pray for something in common. There are certain needs of the Jewish people all over the world. We're unfortunately a people that have not been short of problems. And even today we have communal needs. And we may pray for things we need right now, and we may have dreams that perhaps one day the temple will one day be rebuilt again, and our former glory will be restored.
The religious history of the Temple Mount, Mount Moriah, begins with Abraham, who built an altar on this mountain to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice unto God. Centuries later, God appeared to David the king on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. It was here that David's son Solomon constructed the first temple, perhaps the most costly and beautiful edifice that the world has ever known. This temple was destroyed in 586 BC on the 9th day of the Jewish month of Av by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. It was rebuilt and rededicated in 516 by Zerubbabel and the returnees from Babylonian exile. Around 28 BC, Herod the Great, in order to win favor with the Jews, began an auspicious program of enlarging and refurbishing the temple of Zerubbabel. Herod expanded the temple compound with support walls to the south and to the west, greatly increasing the size of the temple compound. Along the southern end of the compound, he constructed a magnificent colonnaded stoa, or open-aired porch. A staircase along the southern wall provided access into the temple area through double gates known as the Hula gates, after the prophetess Hula from the time of Josiah in 621 BC. From the gates, a staircase led through the wall and then up into the temple compound proper. At one time, it was thought that the location of the temple was where the Dome of the Rock stands today, but it has recently been suggested that it was actually oriented to the north, where the Dome of the Spirits, or the Dome of the Tablets, is situated. Not many years ago, a young man studying at the American Institute of Holy Land Studies here in Jerusalem fell in a tomb at the eastern gate and discovered the archways of the ancient gate into the city. From Jewish sources, this gate apparently was immediately in front of the gate leading into the temple compound. So evidently the temple was situated to the north of the Dome of the Rock. If this is correct, the temple could conceivably be rebuilt without disturbing the Dome of the Rock. Is there any real move to rebuild the temple being made? We hear a lot in Christian circles today, especially evangelical circles, about the rebuilding of the temple. And yes, there are those Jews here in the country today who are interested in the rebuilding of the temple. But by and large, no united effort or specific plans to rebuild the temple are being made. No stones have been cut. None are being cut for the rebuilding of the temple. And those who know Jewish history shouldn't really be surprised. For although the temple was a magnificent structure, and not just a great treasure, but in fact one of the real wonders of the world, the scriptures indicate that God's plan or purpose was not to dwell in a physical structure made with hands, but to dwell in his people. In Exodus chapter 25, verse 8, we read, Asuli Mikdash, v'shechanti b'toch am. Make for me a physical structure, but I'm going to have my dwelling place in them, or in my people. Some might ask about passages in the Bible, such as in the books of Daniel and Revelation, concerning the abomination of desolation standing in the temple. But keeping in mind God's purpose or plan for His people to dwell in them, is it not an interesting question that we pose? Could not the abomination of desolation be, in fact, referring to a falling away on the part of God's people from true biblical faith? Well, only time will tell. All around us, we see the rubble and the ruins of the magnificent temple of God here in Jerusalem, destroyed on the 9th day of the Jewish month of Av in 70 A.D. by Titus and the Roman army. And with the destruction of the temple, an era in Jewish history came to an end. But out of the ashes, out of the ruin, and out of the rubble, a new era began. Although in AD 70, the destruction of this magnificent edifice caused mourning and consternation, the Jews were quick to recover, and the decisions that were made on the part of the spiritual leaders of Judaism had far-reaching implications for the people of God even until today. Non-Jews unfamiliar with the principal tenets of Judaism and Jewish history are unaware of the important changes that took place within the structure of historical Judaism after the destruction of the temple, or the implications that these have for all the people of God until today. Christians, generally speaking, know that with the destruction of the temple, the sacrifices and the oblations ceased. But what is not generally known by Christians are the significant changes that took place in the structure of historic Judaism that have profound implications for all people of God. The historical events are interesting as well as significant. Now, several traditional stories are told, but there is one that is especially interesting. Before the destruction of the temple in 68 of the present era, a very famous rabbi, Yehochanan ben Zakkai, knew that the cause was lost and that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple was imminent. He had his disciples carry him out of the city in a coffin as dead, and from there he was carried directly into the camp of the Roman general Vespasian, the father of Titus, who later destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Once inside the camp, Yehochanan ben Zakkai got out of the coffin and requested an audience with Vespasian. In this meeting, he prophesied from Isaiah chapter 10, Lebanon will fall by a mighty one. Lebanon, he said, was allegorically used for Jerusalem. And in this, he foretold Vespasian's victory. Vespasian was so moved that he granted Ben Zakkai's request to move with his students from Jerusalem to Yavne, south of modern-day Tel Aviv, and there open an academy for the preservation of Judaism. His request was granted, and Ben Zakkai and his disciples moved to Yavne, opened an academy, and after the destruction of the temple, the great Sanhedrin was also transferred to Yavne. The destruction of the temple was a tremendous loss and caused much mourning. But Ben Zakkai and his students knew that Judaism must and could continue to exist, perhaps with even greater meaning and fervor than before. They immediately declared that three things, the reading of Torah, the offering up of prayers, and the doing of acts of tzedakah, righteousness, almsgiving, or charity, took the place and perhaps even superseded the offering up of sacrifices in the temple. This has remained for over 1900 years now as one of the basic principles or tenets of Judaism. And perhaps there is an important lesson to be learned by all those who love God, that the study of God's Word, the offering up of prayers, and the doing of acts of tzedakah, righteousness or kindness to one's fellow man, is perhaps the greatest way in which one can serve God. I hope that that can be a lesson for us all. To treasures of the Jewish world. In our last program, we were talking about the magnificent temple of God in Jerusalem. Long before the destruction of the temple, an institution known as the Synagogue, or in Hebrew, Bet Knesset, developed within the framework of historical Judaism. Its origins are obscure, but we see it as a fully developed institution as early as the 2nd and the 3rd centuries before the present era. In our program today, we're going to be going to Israel and visiting the ruins of several ancient synagogues, and we'll be discussing the Jewish concept of community that developed within the structure of the synagogue, or the Bet Knesset, the functionaries within the framework of the community, and we'll see how all of these functions were carried over into the early community of believers who followed Jesus of Nazareth. The city of Korazim, located just a short distance above the Sea of Galilee, was one of the 3 cities that Jesus cursed, along with Capernaum and Bethsaida. As at other places, the community is largely centered around the sacred area. Here we see the ritual immersion bath complex, one of the finest that we've excavated in the country, and immediately adjacent to the ritual immersion bath complex is a lovely synagogue dating from the 3rd and 4th centuries of the present era. The archaeologists, along with the National Parks Authority here in Israel, have done a magnificent job in the excavation and the restoration of the ancient city of Korazim. We see again the remains of the public buildings in the immediate vicinity of the sacred area. And as we walk through the area of the public buildings over to the synagogue that dates from the 3rd and the 4th century, we will notice how the archaeologists are reconstructing this beautiful synagogue, all constructed out of black basalt. Basalt, as you know, is a volcanic material, and the whole area of Upper Galilee and the Golan from the Sea of Galilee to the north is largely the result of ancient volcanic eruptions. And the hills are just filled with these stones that make an excellent building material. Notice how the restorers have placed the columns back in place here in the synagogue, along with the lintels, and we see again the beautiful decoration that is so typical of the synagogues from this particular period. When the Temple of Solomon was destroyed in 586 BC, and the children of Israel carried captive into Babylon, Judaism did not cease to exist. Actually, Babylon became, in a sense, the refining fire in which the gold of Judaism was refined and purified. And somewhere during that period of time, we don't know exactly when, because its origins are obscure, there developed another institution within the framework of Judaism, which continues to this day, called the synagogue, or Bet Knesset. In the lands of the diaspora, the synagogue became the stabilizing force that held the community together. The word synagoge, synagogue, is a Greek word that is actually the translation for the Hebrew Bet Knesset, which means the house of the assembly. It was a place for prayer and worship, and it was a stabilizing force in the community. Sometimes it also served as a house of study, but actually that later on became a separate institution known as the Bet Midrash, which we will discuss in a later program. The synagogue is a place for prayer and for worship, but we make a very serious mistake when we think of synagogue in the context of a building or a physical structure. Actually, the Bet Knesset is a place for assembly, but assembly for what? For the community as a whole. To think in terms of a building, a physical building, in the context of historical Judaism, when we talk about the assembly, is too confining and too limited. Within the internal structure of Judaism, we must think behind the terms Bet Knesset or synagogue to broader concepts, to the larger sphere of the community as a whole. Herodion is named after King Herod, who built on this site a fortress in the shape of an artificial rounded hill. It rises 100 meters above its surroundings, 752 meters above sea level, and the crest was crowned with 4 round towers, the enclosure filled with gorgeous palaces, apartments, a Roman bath, plus a synagogue. In Roman records from the period, we're told that in the 1st century, there were some 480 synagogues in the city of Jerusalem alone. One of the earliest synagogues that we've excavated is this lovely little synagogue here at Herodium, the burial site of Herod the Great. Undoubtedly, this synagogue was built for those who guarded this site after his body was interred here in this place. The other 2 of the synagogues, the earliest that we've excavated, is Masada to the south and Gamla to the north, and then the synagogue here at Herodium. We're far to the north in the Galilee, up on the Golan, to visit at the ancient Talmudic village of Kitzrein. Come with me and let's walk through the excavations and see some of the magnificent treasures recently unearthed here, treasures of the Jewish world. This large artifact, made out of black basalt, is an olive crusher. The olives would be gathered from the trees, brought here, and placed in this large stone basin. The upright stone is the actual crusher itself, and notice that it has a hole in the center where a large beam would be placed, and then either through manpower or with a little donkey, this upright stone would be rotated around the basin and the olives would be crushed. Then all of the pulp would be collected, taken to another place called the press, where it would actually be pressed and the oil would be manufactured. This is just part of the initial process in the olive making industry. Come with me, if you will, and let's look at another interesting artifact. This artifact happens to be a flour mill. It consists of 2 parts. The upper part is conically shaped, hollowed out, both the top and the bottom, and rests on an inverted cone. The grain would be placed here in the hopper, and then here would be a beam of wood, and here, then the ladies who would be making the flour would rotate the hopper around the conical shaped base. The flour would spill out onto the floor, and then the women would gather it up for the baking of their daily bread. These reconstructed homes here at Kitzrein from the 5th to the 8th centuries of the present era represent for us a real treasure. Let's have a look inside this one. Notice a row of low windows open into the main living area off of an open-air courtyard, and then notice the typical upper room. Now, one thing that is interesting for us here is that the architecture of these homes has changed a little in the centuries before and in the centuries after the time that these houses were constructed. So it gives us a very good idea of what the homes of the ancient people who lived here in this country looked like. Just a few of the houses here at Kitzrein were completely restored, whereas most of them were just partially restored, or we see the ruins of some of the buildings just as they were excavated by the archaeologists. The archaeologists have done us a real service in partially reconstructing, because we're able to see the size of the rooms. Notice again the row of low windows. We're able to see the size of the house, the proximity of one house to the other. But an interesting thing for us to notice as we look out across the community of Korazim is how all of the buildings seem to be clustered together around one central building. The building that is the focus or the focal point of the community, and that is this magnificent synagogue, one of the most interesting that we've excavated in the country, dating from the 6th to the 8th centuries of the present era. Although this synagogue dates from the 6th to the 8th centuries, it does nonetheless rest on the foundations of an earlier synagogue that dates from the 4th to the 5th centuries of the present era. This is quite like the synagogue at Capernaum, which dates from the 4th and 5th centuries, but rests on the foundation of an earlier 1st century synagogue. The architectural style of the synagogue here at Korazim is similar to others that we've excavated in the area, a rectangular shaped building with low stone benches around the walls of the interior. The floor at one time, as you can see, was covered with a beautiful mosaic tile, and then the roof was supported by these magnificent columns that we find here in the center of the synagogue. And notice, very unusual, the column capital here in the synagogue at Korazim is different than anything that we've ever excavated anywhere else in the country. It appears to be a kind of a stylized Ionic capital, and yet if one looks at it carefully, it gives the appearance of being an open scroll. And I'm wondering if perhaps the artist who designed this particular column capital did not in fact have that in mind, as it was here in the synagogue, that the scroll would be unrolled on the Sabbath day and read publicly in worship to the Lord. The capital, as I mentioned, is unique, and it represents a unique treasure for us from the Jewish world. However, when one begins to think about treasures, he tends to think about tangible objects, objects of intrinsic worth, or magnificent monuments, or some kind of a physical structure, such as the synagogue, for example. But let me suggest to you that sometimes an idea or a concept can be a treasure. The concept of community that developed within the structure of the synagogue is a treasure that cannot be overemphasized. Corresponding to the idea of community, there developed the concept of certain functionaries operating with the framework of the community, whose responsibilities or function within the community was designed to minister to some specific need of the community. This particular idea or concept is known as Tzedakah. We translate it into the English as righteousness or almsgiving, but actually the real meaning of the word goes much beyond that. It's an idea or a concept that actually serves as the foundation for true biblical faith. The idea of ministering to and meeting the needs of one's neighbor. And within the organizational structure of the synagogue, each one of the functionaries had a particular function that was in turn designed to meet some need of the community. Here in the synagogue, the principal leader of the synagogue was known as the Nasi, or the president of the synagogue, whose basic function was to see that everything ran smoothly. Then there were the Shlichim, those who were sent out as public announcers by the community to inform the community of various community needs. Then there were the Skenim, or the elders, who were the spiritual leaders of the community. The Batlanim, who were men of leisure that gave themselves to study and probably teaching of the Word. The Gabaim, or the Gaba'ei Tzedakah, those who collected funds and then distributed the funds to those who were needy in the community in acts of righteousness. The Chazan, who ministered in the community in keeping order and doing all kinds of other acts of service. The Magid, who was the wandering evangelist or preacher, and then of course the rabbi, who functioned in the community in a way similar to that of the prophet of the time of the United Kingdom and the divided kingdom. But it's important for us to note and to emphasize that none of these functionaries were functioning in the way of an office as a religious office, but they were individuals who were functioning within the community in a way as to assist or serve one another. And it's quite interesting to note that almost all of these functions were carried over from the context of the synagogue and the Jewish community into the early community of believers who followed Jesus of Nazareth. For example, the Shlichim, the apostles, the Zaken, the elder, became the elders or the bishops later on in the context of the community of believers, the Batlanim, the teachers, the Magid, the evangelists, the Gabaim, the deacons. All of these were ideas or concepts that developed originally within the framework of the Jewish community. However, there was one significant difference, and that is as the church moved to the west, these functions took on the form of ecclesiastical offices rather than serving as a means for service to the community. And thus, the positions were frequently abused, and the needs of the people were left unattended. I know that a lot of these terms that we used in our field report are terms that are unfamiliar to most of you, so I've placed them on the board so that we can have a look at them again in way of review and emphasize again the purpose of each one of them as they functioned within the community of God. You remember in the New Testament, in the first epistle of Paul to the Corinthians, in chapter 12, verse 28 and following, he mentions certain functionaries in the church. And he said, God hath set some in the church, first apostles, then prophets, then teachers, then workers of miracles, those with gifts of healings, helps, administration, different kinds of tongues. And then from Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11, we read about evangelists and pastors. Now, most of us, in looking at these various functionaries as they operate within the framework of the church today, have little real understanding as to how this person should be functioning within the community of God. And the reason why is because we've separated these functionaries apart from the historical foundation of the Jewish community. Have you ever wondered where Jesus got the idea for an apostle, for example? Was he just one day wandering around the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and in some kind of a brilliant stroke of religious genius, he says, I'm going to choose for myself apostles, and we'll travel the countryside together, preaching and teaching about the kingdom of God? And the answer to the question is no. Once we see how the community was organized, and once we see the various functionaries within the community, we can see that all of these functionaries here were already in existence and operating within the community of God before Jesus and the early Christian community. Let's have a look at these functionaries again as they operated within the framework of the Jewish community. Remember the Nasi, he's simply known as the president. Now, this man had no special qualifications to serve in the function in which he serves the community, other than perhaps he may have been exceptionally gifted from an administrative point of view. He was the one who saw that everything ran decently and in order in the context of the synagogue and the synagogue worship. Then the shaliach, from the Hebrew word lishloach, to send. They were the public announcers. They were sent out to announce about community affairs, marriages, weddings, feasts, festivals, etc., etc. The zaken, it means an old person, but as they're functioning within the framework of the community of God, it means the ones who are more mature spiritually and who set the spiritual example for the community or the congregation to follow. The Gabaim or the Gaba'ei Tzedakah are those who are sent out by the Nasi to minister to the temporal needs of those in the community, to meet the needs of the widows and the orphans and others within the community who have a special need. The Batlanim, there had to be 10 in every community. They were the teachers. They were men of leisure that gave themselves to study. And they were either men of independent means or supported by the community, but that's all they did. The Chazan, he saw that order was kept in the community. And interestingly enough, we know also from the Mishnah in Tractate Makot that he was also the one who meted out stripes in way of discipline. If someone had been brought before the rabbinic court and there was any need for any kind of correction within the community. The Magid, the evangelist, the rabbi, the wandering prophet type figure. But again, the important thing for us to note is that all of these functionaries are designed to assist the community. And again, this word, tzedakah, becomes so important for us. I think that we can say that it is one of the foundation stones upon which biblical faith is built. Tzedakah, righteousness, acts of charity, as the congregation moves out into the wider sphere of the community as a whole to minister to the needs of every single member of the community. And would to God that this idea or this concept could again be revived in behalf of the community of God today, so that in the community of God we could be assured that the needs of every single individual in the community would be met, that no one would have to be without, no one would have to be alone, no one would have to be in need. Tzedakah, a foundation principle of biblical faith. Welcome to our program. We have an interesting and unique program for you today. Remember, in our last program on Treasures of the Jewish World, we were talking about the Hebrew concept of tzedakah within the framework of the community of God. Tzedakah, righteousness or almsgiving, acts of charity and kindness, both to the members of the community as well as to those who were not members of the community, simply ministered to because there was a need. We're going to go today to Israel, to the northernmost city in Israel, Metula, on the Lebanese and Israel border, to a place called the Good Fence. And we're going to see an interview with a representative from the southern Lebanese Christian community, Professor Sachar, and a high-ranking officer in the Israeli army, Shraga Kurtz. And both of them are going to share with us about interesting events that are taking place here at this most unusual place in Israel, again called the Good Fence. Now, why is it called the Good Fence? Because a number of years ago, when the Civil War broke out in Lebanon and the war was at its fiercest, members of the southern Lebanese Christian community came to the fence, and they needed all kinds of medical aid and attention. And Israel opened their arms to these members of the Lebanese Christian community. They built a field hospital, they provided medical service, they ministered and treated their needs. And today, Israel is still continuing in this program of military, medical, and economic support to the members of the Lebanese Christian community. Now, listen carefully as we go to our interview to Professor Sachar, because he has some very important things to say. And you'll have to, because of his accent, listen very carefully to catch the import of what he is saying. And also to Shraga Kurtz, the representative of the Israel Armed Forces, and both of these men are going to be showing you how that this concept of tzedakah has been so ingrained within the consciousness of the people of God that it is still being practiced here in Israel unto this very day. We're visiting today at the Good Fence, Hagader HaTorah, on the border of Israel and Lebanon. And I can think of no better place for us to talk about the concept of Tzedakah than here in this place. Visiting with me today is Professor Sachar, who is a former professor of political science at the University of Beirut in Lebanon, and he is now the political advisor to General Lahad of the Lebanese army, and he's with us here today to tell us a little bit about the history of this particular site, as well as about some of the conditions as they have been and as they are today in Lebanon. Professor Sachar, it's a pleasure for me to have you with us here today, and I know that you're a very busy man, and so I especially appreciate your coming to visit with us. Tell me a little bit about the background here of the Good Fence. What is it, the history of it?
If we want to sum up the history of this site, which has been so rightly called the Good Fence, we may say that it's from this point that in 1976, when some groups of Lebanese were fighting alone against the domination of the PLO in the area, could get some help from our neighbors in Israel, a help that has been materialized sometimes militarily through the supply of weaponry, ammunition, and quite often an humanitarian help, because at that time there were no medical substructure left in the area. So the people who lived here, fighting desperately to maintain their freedom against PLO hegemony, had no other way to go to get medical help except Israel. And as you know, officially there has been since 1948 until to now a state of war between Israel and Lebanon, and the border between the two countries have never been opened officially. Yet the Israeli authorities thought that they could make an exception and facilitate the passage through the border, through that gate precisely, which has been called the Good Fence Gate, for people who were in need of medical assistance. There was, at a certain time at the beginning, a sort of military hospital or dispensary in this site exactly, where first aid could be given to patients, outside patients. And it's again through that gate that people who needed more serious treatment, who had serious diseases or were wounded or things like that, could be moved into Israel to receive the proper medical help.
Has it ever seemed strange to you from 1976 to 1982 that the Christian world basically said nothing or did nothing until Israel entered into Lebanon? And as you've said, they actually had no territorial designs, and yet when Israel entered into Lebanon, suddenly the whole world was saying things negatively against Israel, the Israeli army, that they were aggressors, that they were doing this, doing that. And has that ever seemed somewhat strange to you? Have you thought about that?
Of course, we all thought about that. But to be very frank, it did not seem very strange to us. For one simple reason. As you may know, there has been a certain amount of brainwashing going on in the area for years now. It started with the proclamation of the State of Israel. And all of a sudden, all the countries that I called the Arab states, regardless of their differences or their conflicts, try to give of themselves an image as a large brotherhood, brother countries, to the point that the Palestinians, despite all what they did in Lebanon, were looked upon by many people in the West as having rights in Lebanon as much as any Lebanese citizen, forgetting that they were people who were not Lebanese. They were hosts of Lebanon, refugees to use the proper terms, and that this condition does not correspond to political rights or the right to interfere in national affairs in Lebanon. So the conflict on Lebanon was depicted as a civil strife. The government was not strong enough or courageous enough, owing to Arab pressures, to say the truth as it was. In addition to this, one has not to forget that when we talk about the Christian world, it's a big world, but what does it mean really? Is there a Christian world? There are different states, each one having its own interest. They are Christians to a certain extent because the majority of the people were born Christians. Whether they will believe really in their religion or not is another point. But there is not throughout the world something which can be called the Christian world. All right. So they didn't feel that there was a responsibility, a direct responsibility toward the people in Lebanon who started the fight against the Palestinian occupation and terrorists, because these people were mostly Christians. It was something internal for them, or it was convenient for them to say that it was something internal. When Syria entered with its army Lebanon, the same, brother countries, they have come to help. The help eventually became the occupation of 60 or 65% of the Lebanese land, ruling the country without saying it, dismantling the state, paralyzing the institution, making people fight each other, one community against the other, or within one same community. But still it was coming from the one family which is supposed to be the Arab states. When Israel made the operation Peace for Galilee in 1982, the position became immediately different, because Israel was supposed to be, was accepted as the enemy, you know. So the reaction was immediately different. There is a lot of hypocrisy in politics, unfortunately. There are slogans that everyone knows are not true, that still stand at their face value without anyone questioning whether it's a forged money or it's the right sort of banknote you have to carry.
Actually, from your perspective, you don't view Israel as one of these foreign powers, but rather that the basic problem is a foreign power in the person of Syria, who actually in turn is supporting and funding and orchestrating, if you will, the PLO activities in the land.
PLO activities, the Hezbollah activities, all of them.
All comes through Syria.
All comes through Syria.
And if Syria would get away and leave Lebanon alone, they could solve their own problems.
I'm sure of that. And all Lebanese are sure of that.
We're visiting at the Good Fence today with Lieutenant Colonel Shraga, who is the IDF, the Israel Defense Force spokesman for the Israeli government for this whole area. And I want to welcome you to our program today, Lieutenant Colonel, and I also want to thank you for agreeing to visit with us for a while and explain to us something about the situation here in Lebanon. How about taking just a minute or two and first of all giving us some kind of a background up on the situation here in Lebanon, where we're located and how Israel came to be here.
The background is leading us to the mid of 70s, between 75 76, while those Christian villages like Marjayon and Klea were attacked daily by the PLO troops. They were stressed by the PLO. The PLO stressed them and tried to get as much from those inhabitants. The PLO troops rape their women and girls, take money, and try to take as much as they can, and later on use the South Lebanon as a base to go to the main target, Israel, and to penetrate from South Lebanon to the Israeli border and to maintain terror in the Israeli northern settlements.
And when did Israel enter into Lebanon, and what precipitated
Around 76, those head of families, sheikhs and muhtars from Klea and Marjayon, they came to the fence that we can see here. We call it the good fence because here the good and kind relationship between Lebanon and Israel started in 76. Those innocent people asked from the Israeli government through the Israeli settlements here in the north to be equipped with weapons to protect themselves against the PLO, to be aid in a manner of foodstuff, medical stuff, and even hospitalization in Israeli hospitals to their serious wounded among them.
Now, the Lebanese army today, the SLA, the Southern Lebanese Army, is largely trained and supported by Israel. To what extent are you assisting the Southern Lebanese Army, that is Israel?
The extent, it's not a meaning of how many soldiers are in the army. We are talking about the efficiency of these soldiers, the training, and the ability to protect this zone against their enemies.
But you're also providing them basically with weapons, military equipment, ammunition, paying the salary for the soldiers. All of that is at the expense of Israel, is it not?
It's expense of the Israeli government, yes.
Yes. Now, that seems to me to be a tremendous, not just expense, but burden on Israel, whose economy is already hard-pressed because of their own military responsibilities. Just an additional added burden. How many soldiers approximately would you say are on the Israeli
Approximately about 3,000.
About 3,000. And then there's hundreds of Lebanese that cross here at this crossing point called the Good Fence into Israel. They work in Israel. They receive their money. About 1,700.
People are coming daily and crossing through the international border from the west in Nakura, in Rosh Hanikra, in the mid of the zone in border stone 14, and here in the Good Fence in Metula. They are crossing, and they are daily employees in Israel, and at sunset they are coming back to their homes with the good income that they achieve in Israel.
And all of that obviously is draining off of the Israeli economy. Now, it's obvious to me that Israel has no territorial designs, no really political designs in Lebanon. Why would Israel go to all of this trouble, all of this expense, and not just expense, but there have been literally hundreds of young men and young women, Israelis, who have lost their lives in the defense of Lebanon. Why would Israel do something like that?
It's true that the first negotiations with the Lebanese were according their applications to be helped by Israel in the matters of foodstuff, medical stuff, hospitalization, and be supported by Israel against the PLO. Later on, while the PLO was stronger and stronger, and it penetrates through the security zone and through South Lebanon to Israel to attack those civilians in the northern settlements in Israel, we learned to know that the byproduct of a strong South Lebanese army will be peace on the northern boundaries of Israel. So we are aware to the point that if this army, the SLA, will be strong enough to manage security in South Lebanon, the byproduct automatically will be a secure northern boundaries between Lebanon and Israel.
Suppose the shoe had been on the other foot, that Israel had gone to Lebanon and asked for help, or had gone to one of the other Arab countries and had asked for help, or even other countries that we can think of that would have gone to another neighboring country and asked for this kind of help under these kinds of circumstances. How many of them would have responded in the way that Israel responded? And I don't know what you're feeling.
I assume that none. I assume that none, and I can emphasizing the fact that only Israel, the state of Israel, enter Lebanon, and the main reason, once again, is to maintain peace all over the area. But even today, massacre is held between Muslims, between themselves, or between Christians. No one is raising his finger in the UN Convention and say stop it. Israel did it in the past, and she is doing it daily.
Does the word Tzedakah have any meaning to you, Shraga?
The meaning of Tzedakah is helping each other within the community without get any profit from this action. And I'm closely in my mind, Tzedakah is the Israeli activities in Lebanon for the last almost 14 years.
Would you not agree that there's something down inside, something down in the psyche or the mythos of the Jew who has behind them 4,000 years of biblical faith, that there's something down inside that bespeaks this is a mitzvah. We have no other alternative. Somebody has come to us for help. They've asked for help. We've heard their cry. And to do less than what Israel has done would be to go against everything that Israel has believed for 4,000 years. Am I correct?
You're correct, and we mustn't go so far to 4,000 years ago. If I can only mention the Holocaust that held during World War II, that the whole Jewish community were massacred by the Germans and the Nazis, and no one raised his finger and stopped it. In Lebanon, there was massacred. Thousands of people were killed. Hundreds of thousands escape and evacuate from Lebanon. We enter Lebanon to stop it because we are closed in mind and feeling that such, I can say brackets, such a Holocaust was in front of the Lebanese population. And we did our action to stop it.
As a mitzvah?
And it's a mitzvah.
And I
We
believe...
are not benefit from our action in Lebanon, maybe except what I just recognized. The byproduct is, of course, the peace in the north boundaries, to live in peace with our neighbors. We did it in Egypt, we did it now within the Lebanese. And the Lebanese are living with us peacefully in the north line, all these South Lebanese territory, without even a goal to know what will be in the future, but the goal is to live together with all our nations in peace.
Well, I believe that what Israel has done has been something that is unique, perhaps, in human history. ואני מאמין שיש אלוהים בשמיים, והוא יראה, והוא ישמע, והוא יעזור.
I share it from my bottom of my heart, really.
And we just said that I believe that there is a God in heaven and that He sees and He hears and
He will judge.
He will help. He will help. Shraga, I really appreciate your being with me in the program today, your comments, sharing, and we wish you peace and Godspeed. Tihyeh Bari. Be
For all
well.
of us. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And we hope that you also heard and understood, as you saw in a unique way, the practical application even today of this principle of tzedakah in action. We want to thank both Professor Sahar, the representative of the Southern Lebanese Christian community, and Lieutenant Colonel Shraga Kurtz for their interviews, but we also want to take just a moment to express our thanks to the State of Israel and the Israel Defense Forces who allowed us to come into this highly sensitive area to do this unique interview. I hope that it was enlightening for you and it got across in a unique way our idea or our concept of tzedakah that we've been talking about in our last programs and trying to communicate to you as one of the foundations of faith. Welcome to our program, Treasures of the Jewish World. In the next 30 minutes, we're going to be discussing Jewish study and education during the time of the first century of the present era. Were the people of Jesus' day ignorant and unlearned? How highly developed was their educational system? What did they study? And what methods did they use to teach? And how important was education in first century Israel? We'll look at these and other questions in our program today, and we will observe how the educational system of ancient Israel played a dramatic role in shaping the lives of the people and the early church. Let's begin our program by traveling to one of the most beautiful and fascinating treasures of the Jewish world, the historic city of Suffolk. In our last program, we talked about the synagogue and the larger concept of community. We're visiting today in Safed at the ancient synagogue of Yitzhak Luria that dates from the 16th century. Let me give you just a little historical background. In the 2nd century of the present era, Shimon bar Yochai received a mystical interpretation of the Bible known as the Zohar, supposedly received from God. And it's from the word for receive that we got the word Kabbalah. Shimon bar Yochai becomes the father of a movement known in Judaism today as the Kabbalistic movement, the receiving of a deeper spiritual understanding of the Bible and of the things of God. The Kabbalistic movement flourished in Spain during the 13th and 14th centuries. In 1492, when the Jews were cast out of Spain, many of the Jews came here to Safed, and Safed becomes the center for the movement known in Judaism as Kabbalah. The Kabbalistic movement flourished here in Safed during the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, and one of the principal figures in Kabbalah was Yitzhak Luria, known as Ha'ari. This is the synagogue of Ha'ari. He's called Ha'ari, which means the lion, after a rabbi or Adon or Ashkenaz, because he was a German from Ashkenaz, which is the Hebrew word for Germany. Yitzhak Luria Ha'ari, Adon Rabbi Yitzhak, the Lord Rabbi Isaac Luria. So Ha'ari and his disciples became known as the lion's whelps, or the students of the lion, Ha'ari. And in this synagogue, again dating from the 16th century, we see some very interesting features that I want to call to your attention. Notice in the southern wall the beautiful Aron HaKodesh, or the Holy Ark. This one dates from over 100 years ago, and we notice that the curtain covers the doors in which the scrolls of the law are housed that will be brought out and then read in the synagogue on the Sabbath. The pulpit is very interesting, and I'd like to point out to you just a feature or two. We notice something very interesting on the pulpit here in the synagogue of Ha'ari, or Yitzhak Luria. Notice the hole here in the pulpit. This hole is actually a bullet hole. In 1948, during the time of prayer, when the synagogue was packed with people, a missile or a shell came into the synagogue and hit the pulpit here. and you see the hole where the shell hit and exploded, and miraculously no one in the synagogue was hurt. Behind the pulpit is a cabinet known as a Ganesa. Actually, this is a place where old books and manuscripts are housed. The interesting thing about it is these books and manuscripts are no longer used, but instead of throwing them away or burning them, because they believe in Judaism that to burn a book or a manuscript would be burning the name of God, they're placed here in a Ganesa. And it can be something similar to this cabinet, or it could be a room, or they could be placed in another area, but they will be placed there and left there forever. Now, why do they believe that burning a book would be burning the name of God? Because in Hebrew, the way the word is written, it may be that within the context of that particular word or sentence, there would be letters that when they're put together a certain way would spell out the name of God or stand as an abbreviation for the name of God. And because one of the commandments is, thou shalt not use the name of the Lord your God lightly, they believe that by burning a book or destroying it, they would in some way be using the name of God lightly. So the old books are placed here in a Ganesa, and they'll be left here from now on. And many of them are tens and even hundreds of years old. Now, looking at this raises an interesting question for us, and that is the place of learning and study in Judaism. As I mentioned to you, this is the Synagogue of Luria. But immediately adjacent to the synagogue is another institution in Judaism about which we want to talk, and that is the Bet Midrash, or the place of study, located immediately adjacent to the Synagogue of Luria here in Suffolk. Behind me you see the library of books that the students use here in the Bet Midrash for study. Sometimes the synagogue was used as a place for study itself, but usually a special place for study would be constructed immediately adjacent to or in the immediate vicinity of the synagogue. We see in the library the old books. They remind us as we look at them very much of the Ganesa in the synagogue that we saw earlier. And these Ganesas have yielded vast storehouses of knowledge for us, knowledge of inestimable worth, as we found these ancient Ganesas in various places all over the country in our archaeological researches and discoveries, such as the Cairo Ganesa, for example. And it gives us some indication of the importance, the place of study and learning in Judaism. Actually study, learning, the accumulation of knowledge has always held a position of high esteem in Judaism. However sacred the synagogue might be, the Bet Midrash has always held a place of higher esteem and was always considered to be more sacred. In the New Testament, a great deal of space is given to Jesus' birth, but then, until his appearance in the temple at age 12, almost nothing. And from age 12 until he began his public ministry at age 30, again, nothing. And did you ever wonder why he didn't begin his ministry until the age of 30? What was Jesus doing in his early childhood and in his adolescence? We have a very strong indication from a tractate in the Mishnah, the Jewish oral law, that is as interesting as it is pertinent. It's from Order Nezikin, Tractate Avot, chapter 5 and Mishnah 21. And it tells us that Yosef ben Tema used to say, at 5 years of age, one is ready for the study of the Scripture. At 10 years of age, one is fit for the study of the Mishnah. At the age of 13, for the fulfillments of the commandments, or the bar mitzvah. At the age of 15, for the study of the Talmud. At the age of 18, for marriage. At the age of 20, for pursuing one's vocation. At the age of 30, for moving into one's full vigor. At the age of 40, for understanding. 50, for counsel, and then on through the rest of one's life. Now, although this statement cannot be dated with certainty and may come from, perhaps 70 to 150 years after the time of Jesus, it does nonetheless reflect what the Jewish boy in Jesus' day would be doing in each stage of his growth and development. There are numerous passages in the Mishnah, the Talmud, that indicate the importance of education placed on the child. The Talmud even provides information about class size. In Baba Batra 21a, we're told that the maximum number of pupils that should be placed under one teacher is 25. If there are 50, an additional teacher should be provided. If there are 40, a senior student should be engaged to assist the master. Most Christians know that the synagogue is the Jewish house of prayer and worship. But few Christians are aware that each synagogue usually had its own elementary school, or Bet Sefer, and its own high school, the Bet Midrash. And as we've previously mentioned, even to this day, the Bet Midrash is key in prominence and considered more sacred than the synagogue. As a matter of fact, the rabbis taught that study is the highest form of worship. And you remember Paul in his second epistle to Timothy, chapter 2 and verse 15, emphasizes the importance of study with these words, "Study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that does not need to be ashamed, because he knows how to interpret the word of truth correctly." However, there is one fact that is of the utmost importance for our understanding of the subject at hand. Although scrolls or books for reading and study were used, and although the practice of writing was highly developed, writing materials were costly and scarce, and all manuscripts had to be written by hand, and they had scribes trained in this profession. Therefore, learning usually meant memorization. One of my colleagues in the Jerusalem School for the Study of the Synoptic Gospels, Professor Shmuel Safrai, in an article entitled Education and the Study of Torah from the Jewish People in the First Century, Volume 2, relates, and I'm quoting, "Individual and group study of the Bible, repetition of passages, etc., were often done by chanting them aloud. There is the frequent expression, the chirping of the children, which was heard by people passing close by a synagogue as the children were reciting a verse. Adults, too, in individual and group study, often read aloud, for it was frequently advised not to learn in a whisper but aloud. This was the only way to overcome the danger of forgetting. In the eyes of the rabbis, repetition was the key to learning. And in the Mishnah, in Chagigah, we read, "One who repeats his lesson 100 times is not like he who repeats it 101 times. All kinds of methods were devised to assist the student in memorization. In elementary school, the children were instructed in the Hebrew language and in Torah, the law of Moses. Lessons took place on all the days of the week, including the Sabbath, when they would, however, read no new material but repeat their earlier lessons. We even find the children going over their lessons on Friday evening in the synagogue. Now, from these written sources, the Mishnah, the Talmud, we can say with a great deal of certainty what Jesus was doing in his early childhood and his adolescence. He was studying, committing vast quantities of material to memory, Scripture, Mishnah, the oral law, Midrash, the commentary on Scriptures, Halakha, the rabbinical legal rulings, all the available sacred literature and commentaries of his day. And it's important to emphasize that this was exactly what most of the other children in his day were doing, to such an extent that most of the people in Jesus' day had large portions of this literature firmly committed to memory, and, at the very least, all of the Old Testament. It's only when we understand this that we can understand the peculiar way in which the rabbis of Jesus' day taught. But at the focus of all their education was a principle, an overriding or underlying principle that perhaps stands as the foundation stone upon which biblical faith is built. A careful examination of the rabbi's teachings reveals an entire philosophy of life as they set it forth from the very beginning in the teaching of the Aleph Bet. This principle is one of which we've spoken before, the principle of Tzedakah. The Aleph Bet speaks directly to man as they teach it, telling him of the purpose of his life, directing his striving, channeling his activities, refining his urges. It makes him not only a servant of God, but of man. Indeed, it makes him a fitting vehicle to justify the very creation of the universe. Small wonder that the Talmudic sages describe the teachings of those children as unequaled even in the days of Joshua, the successor of Moses. A passage in the Talmud in Shabbat 104a is the Talmud's only complete discussion of the Aleph Bet. And let's take a moment and notice how that in the teaching of the Aleph Bet, the rabbis are setting forth this basic principle of life. As they teach, the rabbis say that the Aleph Bet stands for Aluf Binah, learn understanding. The Gimel Dalet stands for Gemol Dalim, be kind to the poor. And they say, why is the foot of the Gimel stretched towards the Dalet? Because it is proper for those to do kindness, to run after the needy. And why is the foot of the Dalet stretched towards the Gimel? Because the poor person should make himself available to him. And why is the Dalet's face turned from the Gimel? Because the rich should give to the poor discreetly, in order that he not feel ashamed before him. Then the Hey Vav, that's the name of the Holy One, blessed be He. And then the Zayin Chet Tet Yud Kaf Lamed, it's taught that if you fulfill the above, namely being kind to the poor, the Holy One, blessed be He, will sustain you, Zan, and will show you favor, Chan, and will do you good, Meitiv, and give you a heritage, Yerusha, and He will bind a crown, Keter, upon you for the world to come, Le'olam Haba. The open mem and the closed mem represent open teaching or revealed teaching, Ma'amar Patuach and Ma'amar Satum. The bent nun and the straight nun teach that if a faithful person, a ne'eman, is humble or bent, he will become an erect person in the world to come. The Samech and Ayin teach that one should support the poor, smoch aniim, or another version is that one should devise aseh memory aids, simanim, in the study of Torah in order to acquire or to memorize it. The bent pay and the straight pay allude to an open mouth and a closed mouth. And the idea was that when no one better is available to expound on the Torah, then you should open your mouth and do so. But if more qualified people than you are there, then you should close your mouth and remain silent. The bent tzaddik and the straight tzaddik teach that if a righteous person, a tzaddik, is humble, that is bent, he will become an erect or a righteous person. But this is identical to the earlier teaching of the bent and the straight, faithful person, the ne'eman. Scripture means to stress that it's praiseworthy for one to continue adding more humility to whatever humility that he already has. From this we see that the Torah was given to those with exceeding humility. The Kuf stands for the Holy One, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Resh stands for the wicked person, the Rasha. And why is the face of the Kuf turned away from the Rasha? Because the Holy One says, if he repents, I will bind upon him a crown like my own. And why is the leg of the Kuf suspended? Because if he repents and seeks to ascend, he can ascend by means of this opening. But let him ascend through there, in other words, through the open bottom of the Kuf. This supports a view of Resh Lachish that said, why does the Scripture say, for the scorners he has scorn, but to the humble he gives favor? If someone comes to defile himself, they open the way for him. If they come to purify himself, they assist. The Shin stands for falsehood, sheker, and the Tav stands for truth, emet. And why are the letters of falsehood, sheker, juxtaposed in the alphabet with the letter of truth? And why are the letters of truth, emet, spread out? Because the aleph and the tav are at either end. And the mem, or the center letter of the alphabet, is in between. And the rabbis say because falsehood is common and truth is uncommon. And why do the letters of falsehood stand on one foot? Because falsehood does not stand firm. And why do the letters of truth have brick-like solidity? Because truth does stand firm. With those who were a part of the family of God, we can easily understand why education or study was so important. The study, however, centered principally around the Word of God. The early Jewish believers continued this tradition of learning. Unfortunately, in spite of the specific injunction on the part of the Apostle Paul to study, as the church moved to the West, this concept of education and study was lost. And unfortunately, without study, there can be no understanding. And without understanding, there can be no proper action. And I think perhaps that the words of Jesus when he said, "Not every one that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, is going to be a part of my kingdom, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven," is especially appropriate here at this point. Only when we study can we know. Only as we know can we do. Knowledge is power. Ignorance is powerlessness. And therefore, it is incumbent upon all of the people of God to return to this basic fundamental principle of biblical worship and faith, study, that we might get back into the Word of God, that we might give ourselves diligently to study in order that we might know how to properly and correctly respond to others of those of the family of God and even strangers here in the world. Because you see, the action or the direction or the focus of the people of God was not inward, but it was out there in ministry, ministering to the needs of the people. And only as we know can we go. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our program today on the subject of study and education, and I hope it will be a challenge to you to further study, that you might show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needs not to be ashamed, because you know how to rightly or correctly interpret the word of truth. If you've enjoyed our programs, and if you are enjoying our programs here on Treasures of the Jewish World, we'd appreciate hearing from you. We'd appreciate a letter telling us that you're watching, that you're enjoying our programs. Just look at the address at the end of the program, drop us a line. We'll appreciate it. God bless.